The World Trade Organization is an intergovernmental organization that regulates and facilitates international trade between nations. It officially commenced operations on 1 January 1995, pursuant to the 1994 Marrakesh Agreement, thus replacing the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that had been established in 1948. The WTO is the world's largest international economic organization, with 164 member states representing over 96% of global trade and global GDP. The WTO facilitates trade in goods, services and intellectual property among participating countries by providing a framework for negotiating trade agreements, which usually aim to reduce or eliminate tariffs, quotas, and other restrictions. These agreements are signed by representatives of member governments, Fall Point 9 to 10, and ratified by their legislatures. The WTO also administers independent dispute resolution for enforcing participants' adherence to trade agreements and resolving trade-related disputes. The organization prohibits discrimination between trading partners, but provides exceptions for environmental protection, national security, and other important goals. The WTO is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. Its top decision-making body is the Ministerial Conference, which is composed of all member states and usually convenes biannually. Consensus is emphasized in all decisions. Day-to-day functions are handled by the General Council, made up of representatives from all members. A secretariat of over 600 personnel, led by the Director General and 4 deputies, provides administrative, professional, and technical services. The WTO's annual budget is roughly $220 million United States dollars, which is contributed by members based on their proportion of international trade. Studies show the WTO has boosted trade and reduced trade barriers. It has also influenced trade agreement generally. A 2017 analysis found that the vast majority of preferential trade agreements up to that point explicitly reference the WTO, with substantial portions of text copied from WTO agreements. Goal 10 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals also referenced WTO agreements as instruments of reducing inequality. However, critics contend that the benefits of WTO-facilitated free trade are not shared equally, citing the outcomes of negotiations and data showing a continually widening gap between rich and poor nations. The WTO precursor General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, a comparable international institution for trade, named the International Trade Organization, never started as the US and other signatories did not ratify the Establishment Treaty, and so GATT slowly became a de facto international organization. 7 rounds of negotiations occurred under GATT, but in 1997 WTO members agreed to terminate the bovine meat and dairy agreements, leaving only 2. Despite attempts in the mid-1950s and 1960s to establish some form of institutional mechanism for international trade, the GATT continued to operate for almost half a century as a semi-institutionalized multilateral treaty regime on a provisional basis. Well before GATT's 40th anniversary, its members concluded that the GATT system was straining to adapt to a new globalizing world economy. In response to the problems identified in the 1982 Ministerial Declaration, the 8th GATT round, known as the Uruguay Round, was launched in September 1986, in Punta del Este, Uruguay. It was the biggest negotiating mandate on trade ever agreed. The talks aimed to extend the trading system into several new areas, notably trade in services and intellectual property, and to reform trade in the sensitive sectors of agriculture and textiles. All the original GATT articles were up for review. The final act concluding the Uruguay round and officially establishing the WTO regime was signed 15 April 1994, during the ministerial meeting at Marrakesh, Morocco, and hence is known as the Marrakesh Agreement. The GATT still exists as the WTO's umbrella treaty for trade in goods, updated as a result of the Uruguay round negotiations. GATT 1994 is not, however, the only legally binding agreement included via the final act at Marrakesh. A long list of about 60 agreements, annexes, decisions, and understandings was adopted. The agreements fall into 6 main parts. In terms of the WTO's principle relating to tariff ceiling binding, the Uruguay round has been successful in increasing binding commitments by both developed and developing countries, as may be seen in the percentages of tariffs bound before and after the 1986 to 1994 talks. The highest decision-making body of the WTO, the Ministerial Conference, usually meets every 2 years. It brings together all members of the WTO, all of which are countries or customs unions. The Ministerial Conference can take decisions on all matters under any of the multilateral trade agreements. Some meetings, such as the inaugural Ministerial Conference in Singapore and the Cancun Conference in 2003, involve